At 7:12 on a Sunday morning, I walked into my own kitchen and found 14 rules taped to my refrigerator. Not suggestions, rules, printed in bold black letters, laminated, and signed at the bottom by my daughter-in-law. House rules for Edward. I stood there, in my slippers, holding an empty coffee mug, staring at my own name on the refrigerator I had bought with my own money. Rule number 1. Edward must stay out of the kitchen after 7 p.m. Rule number 5. All mail addressed to Edward must be placed in the basket by the front door for review. Rule number 8. Edward may not use the garage workshop without supervision. Rule number 11. Edward must stop bringing up Miriam at dinner. And rule number 14. Edward will begin discussing senior living options before the end of the month. Then Brianna walked in wearing my late wife's floral cooking apron. "Good," she said. "You saw them." My son Michael followed behind her, staring at the floor like a man who had already chosen cowardice. I looked at the kitchen my wife had painted by hand. The breakfast nook where I had helped Michael with his homework. The back door where Miriam used to watch the pear tree bloom. Then I looked back at the laminated rules. "Brianna," I asked quietly, "whose house do you think this is?" She smiled like a manager correcting an employee. "At your age, Edward, ownership is not the same as control." That was when I understood. This was not about boundaries. This was a takeover. So I did not reach out and tear the paper down. I did not raise my voice and demand that they pack their bags. I had spent 35 years working as a municipal building inspector and a property assessor. I understood structural integrity. I understood leverage. And most importantly, I understood that the person who loses their temper usually loses the argument. I photographed it, every rule, every line, every signature. Because Brianna had made one critical mistake. She thought she had written rules for an old man. What she had actually written was evidence. Brianna did not know that Miriam had left this house with more protection than any locked door could provide. The tragedy of this situation did not begin with a laminated list of rules. It began a year and a half earlier, with a phone call from a desperate son. Michael had always been a dreamer. A man who chased the next big business idea without ever fully securing the foundation of the previous one. He and Brianna had been living in an expensive, high-rise apartment downtown, funding a lifestyle that looked fantastic on social media, but was built entirely on credit and precarious investments. When the market shifted, Michael's boutique logistics company went under. It didn't just fail. It collapsed completely, taking their savings and their apartment, Louis, down with it. I remember the evening he came to the house. He sat at the kitchen table, looking completely broken, while Brianna sat next to him, her face a mask of barely concealed panic. They were a week away from being formally evicted. They had nowhere to go, and her parents had bluntly refused to take them in. "Dad," Michael had pleaded, staring at the grain of the wooden table. "Just for a little while, just until I can get another business loan approved and we can find a new place." I didn't hesitate. I am a father. You do not watch your child drown when you have a boat large enough to pull them out of the water. "Of course you can stay," I told them. The conditions I set were simple, rooted in kindness but structured for clarity. I told them they could have the 2 spare bedrooms upstairs for 6 months, rent-free. They needed to use that time to save money and aggressively pay down their debts. I asked them not to interfere with the property paperwork, and above all, I asked them to respect the spaces that still belonged to Miriam's memory, particularly the garage workshop and her basement sewing room. In the beginning, Brianna was the picture of gratitude. "Oh, Edward, thank you so much," she had said, hugging me tightly. "We just need a little time to get back on our feet. We'll stay out of your way, I promise." But gratitude is a fragile thing, easily corrupted by comfort. The first month, they were quiet guests. The second month, the subtle shifts began. Brianna started rearranging the furniture in the living room, claiming the new layout had better feng shui. I let it go. It was just furniture. By the 4th month, she had taken down Miriam's heavy velvet curtains in the dining room and replaced them with sheer, modern blinds without asking me. When I brought it up, she brushed it off, saying the house needed more natural light and that the velvet was collecting dust. By the 6th month, the month they were supposed to move out, there was no talk of leaving. The business loan Michael had promised to secure never materialized. Instead, Brianna began referring to my home as ours. She commandeered the kitchen, pushing my favorite cast-iron skillets to the back of the pantry to make room for her expensive juicers and espresso machines. She started inviting her friends over for wine nights, effectively exiling me to my downstairs bedroom because she said my presence in the living room made her guests uncomfortable. I watched it happen step by insidious step. I watched her pack Miriam's antique china into cardboard boxes and store them in the basement to make room for her minimalist ceramic plates. I endured it. I endured the slow erasure of my wife's touch from the house because I loved my son. I thought I was providing a safe harbor for a family in crisis. I mistook their comfort for gratitude. That was my first mistake. And as the months dragged on, Michael's posture changed. The guilt he initially felt about crashing in his father's house faded, replaced by a quiet, cowardly submission to his wife's escalating demands. He stopped defending my space. He stopped defending Miriam's memory. He chose the path of least resistance, allowing Brianna to slowly, methodically assume control of a property she had not paid a single dime to maintain. I slid my phone back into the pocket of my robe, having secured the photograph of the house rules. I walked past Brianna, who was now aggressively chopping fruit on the island, and poured myself a cup of coffee. "Dad," Michael said softly as I walked back toward the hallway. I stopped, turning to look at him. He still couldn't meet my eyes. "Dad, just follow the rules for a while," Michael mumbled, his voice thick with a pathetic, desperate plea for avoidance. It's not a big deal. It will keep the peace." I stared at the son I had raised. I stared at the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle in the driveway outside. The boy I had taught to stand up for himself. "Peace that requires my silence is not peace, Michael," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "It is permission." I turned my back on them and walked down the hallway to my bedroom. I closed the door quietly behind me. I walked over to the heavy oak nightstand next to my bed. I opened the bottom drawer and moved a stack of old photo albums aside. Resting at the very bottom, perfectly preserved in a protective plastic sleeve, was a thick blue legal folder. Miriam had always been the most fiercely protective person I had ever known. She had fought cancer with the same terrifying intensity she used to protect our family. And before she died, she had spent a considerable amount of time with our estate attorney, quietly putting structural safeguards in place that even I hadn't fully appreciated at the time. I pulled the blue trust folder out of the drawer and set it on the bed. Brianna thought she had written rules for an old man. What she had actually written was evidence. The implementation of the house rules began the very next morning, executed with a kind of cheerful, terrifying efficiency. Brianna did not act like a dictator shouting orders. She acted like a concerned caregiver managing a difficult patient. It was a strategy designed to make any resistance from me look like the irrational stubbornness of an aging man. The first major escalation was the mail. For 35 years, I had walked to the mailbox at the end of the driveway every afternoon at 3 o'clock. It was a simple ritual, but it was mine. On Monday afternoon, I opened the metal mailbox and found it completely empty. I walked back into the house and found Brianna in the kitchen, sorting through my bank statements, my utility bills, and my pension documents. She was placing them into a small decorative wicker basket she had placed on the console table by the front door. "Brianna," I said, stopping in the hallway, "what are you doing with my mail?" She didn't even look up from the envelope she was examining. "Rule number 5, Edward," she said smoothly. dropping a letter from my insurance company into the basket. We need to make sure nothing gets lost. You've been so forgetful lately. I'm just organizing it so Michael and I can help you keep track of your finances. I wasn't forgetful. I had never missed a payment in my life. She was systematically intercepting my financial information to assess exactly how much liquid capital I had tied to the house. I didn't argue. I didn't snatch the letters out of her hand. I simply walked back to my bedroom, opened a small notebook I kept in my nightstand, and wrote down the date and time of the mail interception. I was no longer a father living with his family. I was a building inspector gathering code violations on a condemned property. The next violation occurred 3 days later, and it cut far deeper. The garage workshop was my sanctuary. It was where I kept my tools, where I restored old furniture, and where Miriam had spent her evenings sewing while I worked. On Thursday morning, I walked out to the garage to repair a loose hinge on a kitchen cabinet. The heavy wooden door to the workshop wouldn't open. I jiggled the handle, thinking the old latch had finally seized up. Then I looked down. A heavy, industrial-grade padlock had been installed on the exterior hasp. I turned around and saw Brianna standing on the back porch, sipping a cup of herbal tea. "I had to lock it, Edward," she called out, her voice loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "Rule number 8. It's just not safe for you to be around heavy machinery anymore without supervision. You could hurt yourself." I looked at the padlock. I had built the entire back deck of the house with those tools. I had rewired the electrical panel. I knew every saw, every drill, and every wrench in that room. It wasn't about safety. A few hours later, I understood her true motive. I was sitting on the back patio when a contractor's van pulled into the driveway. A man with a clipboard walked up to Brianna, who was waiting for him on the front lawn. I stayed out of sight, listening through the open breezeway. "Yes," Brianna told the contractor, pointing toward my locked workshop. "We're looking to completely gut the garage. We want to convert it into a luxury home office and a small gym. We'll need the concrete sealed and climate control installed." The contractor nodded. "It's a great space for it. Does the homeowner have the permits ready?" "Oh, don't worry about the paperwork," Brianna said, waving her hand dismissively. "We're in the process of transferring the estate management. Edward is transitioning soon. We just want to get a head start on the remodeling quotes." She was already measuring the drapes for a house she hadn't even stolen yet. But Brianna wasn't just working inside the house. She was actively campaigning outside of it, laying the groundwork for a narrative that would justify her eventual takeover. Our next-door neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, was a retired schoolteacher who had been close friends with Miriam. One afternoon, while I was tending to the rose bushes in the side yard, I heard Brianna speaking to Mrs. Alvarez over the wooden fence. I stayed crouched behind the thick foliage of the rhododendrons, listening. "It's just been so exhausting, Maria," Brianna was saying, her voice thick with fake, tragic exhaustion. "Michael and I are doing everything we can, but Edward is, well, he's declining." "Declining?" Mrs. Alvarez asked, sounding genuinely alarmed. "He seemed perfectly fine when I spoke to him on Sunday." Brianna sighed deeply. "He hides it well from the neighbors. But behind closed doors, he's wandering around at night. He's getting aggressive when we try to help him. We had to put rules up in the kitchen just to keep him safe. We're having to manage everything for him now. At some point, love means admitting the old life is over." I felt a cold rush of adrenaline in my veins. This wasn't just a disrespectful daughter-in-law. This was a calculated textbook case of elder abuse. She was isolating me, restricting my access to my own property, intercepting my communications, and destroying my credibility with the community. If she could convince the neighborhood, and eventually a judge, that I was mentally unfit, she and Michael could petition for legal guardianship. They could force a sale of the house. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place on Friday evening. I walked into the kitchen to get a glass of water. Brianna and Michael were not in the room. But Brianna had left her laptop open on the kitchen island. Next to the laptop was a stack of glossy brochures. I picked one up. Whispering Pines Assisted Living, Luxury Senior Care. I looked at the laptop screen. Her email inbox was open. The top email was a message thread between Brianna and Michael, sent just 20 minutes earlier. I didn't need to guess what they were planning. It was written in plain text, right there on the screen. I leaned over and read the exchange. Michael's message read, "Bri, I don't know about this." The realtor called again. "Dad won't agree to sign a home equity line. He's not going to just hand over the deed so we can leverage the house. He loves this place." Brianna's reply had been sent 3 minutes later. "He doesn't have to agree right now. We just need the realtor to give us a valuation so we know what we're working with. Once Edward transitions to Whispering Pines, we can finally use the house properly. We'll have power of attorney by the end of the month," Michael had replied. "But what if he refuses to go?" Brianna's final message was the most chilling thing I had ever read in my own home. "Then we make agreeing look like the safest option. Stop being weak, Michael. Do you want to live in a studio apartment for the rest of your life?" I stared at the glowing screen of the laptop. My son, the boy I had sheltered, the man I had bailed out of bankruptcy, was actively conspiring with his wife to declare me incompetent so they could strip the equity out of my home and throw me into a facility. I didn't touch the laptop. I didn't confront them. I walked back to my bedroom and closed the door. I sat down on the edge of the bed and looked at the heavy oak nightstand where the blue trust folder was waiting. For 1.5 years, I had tried to be a generous father. I had swallowed my pride, given up my space, and tolerated the disrespect because I believed that family was supposed to help family when times were hard. But looking back at the escalating campaign of the last week, the mail basket, the padlock on the garage, the lies to Mrs. Alvarez, and the glossy brochures for Whispering Pines, I realized how incredibly naive I had been. That was when I understood the rules were not about peace. They were about removing me one room at a time. The blue folder was heavy, filled with thick, textured legal paper that smelled faintly of the lavender sachets Miriam used to keep in her desk drawers. I sat on the edge of my bed, the door securely locked against the people trying to steal my life, and untied the thin string holding the folder closed. Inside were 4 distinct items. The first was the original deed to the house, stamped and notarized 35 years ago. It bore both of our names, a physical testament to a lifetime of shared labor and shared love. The second was a copy of the family occupancy agreement that Michael and Brianna had signed 18 months ago when they moved in. It was a standard, temporary residential license drafted by my attorney. It clearly stated their stay was a 6-month courtesy, granting them no equity, no tenant rights, and strictly forbidding any structural alterations or interference with the primary homeowner's quiet enjoyment of the property. They had broken every single clause on the page. The third item was a thick, bound document titled the Miriam Whitaker Family Trust, and the fourth was a sealed white envelope with my name written across the front. I opened the envelope first. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded the heavy stationery, recognizing the sharp, elegant cursive of the woman I had loved for 40 years. "My dearest Edward," the letter began. "If you are opening this folder, it means I am gone, and the house we built is no longer feeling like a home." I stopped reading for a moment, a sharp ache catching in my throat. Miriam had always been profoundly observant. Even while she was dying, she was watching our son, watching the woman he had married, and understanding the dangerous trajectory of their entitlement. "Michael is a good boy," Miriam wrote, "but he is a weak man. He will always seek the path of least resistance, and Brianna will always seek the path of maximum control. I know your heart, Edward. I know you will try to accommodate them. You will shrink yourself to avoid a fight. But a house is not a prize for the loudest person in the family. It is shelter for the one who kept it warm." I looked up at the wall. where a framed photograph of Miriam standing under the pear tree hung in the shadows. If anyone ever makes you feel like a guest in the home we built, Edward, read this before you answer them. Do not let them take your peace. Let the trust do the fighting for you. I love you, Miriam. I carefully set the letter aside and picked up the bound trust document. During her final months, Miriam had transferred her half of our entire estate, the house, her life insurance, and our shared investments, into an irrevocable family trust. I was named as the sole custodian and primary beneficiary. I had full, uncontested control over the property for the rest of my natural life. But it was the protective clauses in Section 4 that made my breath catch in my lungs. Miriam hadn't just secured my ownership. She had weaponized it against the exact scenario currently unfolding in my kitchen. Clause 4A. Lifetime right of residency. It explicitly stated that no individual, regardless of their relation to me, could compel, coerce, or force me to vacate the primary residence. Clause 4. The anti-coercion provision. This was the masterpiece. It stipulated that if any future beneficiary of the trust, namely, Michael, attempted to restrict my access to the property, isolate me from my community, or fraudulently claim I lacked the mental capacity to manage my own affairs for the purpose of financial gain, they would immediately trigger a punitive disinheritance protocol. They wouldn't just be evicted. They would be permanently severed from the multi-million-dollar estate. Miriam had written a clause for a wound I had not been brave enough to admit existed. She had foreseen my weakness, and she had built a legal fortress to protect me from it. I closed the folder, picked up my phone, and dialed Evelyn Price. Evelyn was a senior partner at one of the most ruthless property and estate law firms in the state. She had also been Miriam's closest confidant for 3 decades. She answered on the 3rd ring. "Edward," Evelyn asked, sounding surprised. "It's Friday night. Is everything all right?" "Evelyn," I said, my voice steady and cold, "I need to see you first thing Monday morning. I need you to bring Carl Benson from the Trust Management Office, too." There was a brief pause. Evelyn's professional instincts instantly recognized the tone of my voice. "What happened?" "Brianna happened," I replied. "She's moving to declare me incompetent. She's intercepting my mail, locking me out of the garage, and trying to secure a home equity line." Evelyn let out a sharp, angry breath. "Has she put anything in writing?" "We need hard proof of coercion if we're going to activate Miriam's protective clauses, without dragging this through a drawn-out civil court battle." I opened the photo gallery on my smartphone. "She taped 14 laminated rules to my refrigerator," I told her, signed in blue ink. "And she's hosting a family dinner next Thursday to officially discuss my transition to an assisted living facility." "I'll clear my Monday schedule," Evelyn said immediately. "Send me those photos right now." When I walked into Evelyn's downtown law office on Monday morning, the atmosphere was highly charged. Evelyn was sitting at a massive mahogany conference table. Next to her sat Carl Benson, the trust officer assigned to manage the financial mechanisms of the Miriam Whitaker Family Trust. Carl was a meticulous, humorless man who viewed any threat to a trust he managed as a personal insult. Evelyn had printed out the photograph I sent her. The large, laminated image of *house rules for Edward lay dead center on the polished wood table. She was staring at it, shaking her head in disbelief. I sat down across from them, placing the blue trust folder on the table. "I've documented the mail interception," I said, handing Evelyn my notebook. "I've also secured a statement from my neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, confirming that Brianna has been spreading false rumors about my cognitive decline in the neighborhood." Carl Benson adjusted his glasses, looking at the notebook. "Mr. Whitaker," Carl said precisely, "your daughter-in-law and your son are currently residing in the home under a temporary family occupancy agreement, correct?" "Yes," I replied. "It expired a year ago. I let them stay out of kindness." "You were allowed to stay here because Edward was generous," Carl murmured almost to himself, looking at the arrogant list of rules. You mistook generosity for transfer of ownership. Evelyn leaned forward, tapping her manicured fingernail against the photograph of the laminated rules. Edward, Evelyn said, her eyes flashing with a predatory legal brilliance. When you told me she was trying to push you out, I was worried this was going to turn into a messy, he said. She said domestic dispute. Courts hate family evictions. They get bogged down in emotional arguments. She picked up the printed photo. But this? Evelyn continued, gesturing to the rules. She didn't just insult you, Edward. She documented coercive control. I looked at the rules again. Edward must stay out of the kitchen. Edward must ask before inviting guests. Every single one of these demands is a direct violation of your legal right to quiet enjoyment of your own property, Evelyn explained. The mail rule is a federal offense if she's actually opening your financial statements. The garage rule is an illegal restriction of access. And the senior living rule? Evelyn looked at Carl. That is textbook coercion, Carl finished for her. She is actively attempting to establish a hostile environment to force a transition of the estate. So what do we do? I asked. Do I serve them with an eviction notice? Evelyn smiled, a very thin, very dangerous smile. No, Evelyn said. An eviction notice takes 30 days, and it gives them time to destroy property, drain accounts, or hire a slimy defense attorney to delay the process. Because the house is owned by the trust, and because they are violating the explicit anti-coercion clauses Miriam put in place, we don't have to evict them as tenants. We revoke their temporary occupancy license, Carl clarified, immediately. When does this family transition dinner happen? Evelyn asked, leaning back in her chair. Thursday evening, I replied. Brianna invited her parents. She also invited the realtor she brought over to appraise the house, and a consultant from Whispering Pines Assisted Living. She wants to use the crowd to pressure me into signing a temporary household management authorization. She wants an audience, Evelyn noted, her eyes narrowing. She wants to look like the savior taking care of the poor, confused father-in-law. Exactly, I said. Evelyn looked at Carl, who gave a brief, sharp nod of agreement. Then we give her an audience, Evelyn said, closing her leather notebook. I will draft the immediate revocation order. Carl will prepare the trust disinheritance execution for Michael. She stood up, looking down at the printed photo of the house rules one last time. Evelyn read Miriam's clause twice, then looked at the laminated sheet. Edward, she said, your daughter-in-law just gave us the cleanest evidence we could have asked for. The atmosphere in my dining room on Thursday evening was suffocatingly pleasant. Brianna had spared no expense, or rather, she had spared no expense on my credit card, which she had managed to borrow for the catering. She called the gathering a house harmony meeting, a phrase that sounded like a corporate team-building exercise rather than a family dinner. She had set the long oak dining table with my wife's best silver and arranged an elaborate charcuterie board in the center. But it was the guest list that truly revealed the predatory nature of the evening. Brianna's mother, Linda, was sitting near the head of the table, sipping wine with a look of supreme entitlement. Across from her sat a sharp-dressed woman introducing herself as a senior transition specialist from Whispering Pines Assisted Living. Next to her was a local realtor who kept aggressively complimenting the crown molding. My son Michael sat silently near the kitchen door. Our neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, had also been invited, presumably to serve as a witness to the community that Brianna was handling my decline with grace. And then there were two empty chairs at the far end of the table. When Brianna clinked her fork against her wine glass to call the room to attention, she wore the expression of a martyr graciously accepting a burden. Thank you all so much for coming tonight, Brianna began, placing a perfectly manicured hand over her heart. As you know, this has been a difficult year of transitions. Edward has given so much to this family. He built a beautiful life here with Miriam, but seasons change. Now it is time for him to let us take care of him, and time for him to let us take care of the house. Linda, her mother, nodded enthusiastically, taking a large sip of her Pinot Grigio. "It's the right thing to do, Brianna," Linda said loudly. "Honestly, an old man rattling around in a big house is selfish when young families need space. It's time to let the next generation step up." Michael flinched at the word selfish, but he didn't raise his head. He just stared at his plate. Brianna smiled warmly at the room and then reached under the table, pulling out a sleek leather portfolio. She opened it and slid a stack of neatly printed papers toward me. "Edward, we've prepared some administrative updates to make everything easier," Brianna said, her voice dropping into a gentle, condescending tone. "It's just some standard paperwork. A temporary household management authorization so Michael and I can handle the bills without bothering you. A mail handling consent form for your privacy, and an authorization for the home equity consultation so we can start making the house safer for you." She tapped the last paper with her French-tipped fingernail. "And, of course, the assisted living tour agreement with Whispering Pines," she added softly. "Just to explore our options. All you need to do is sign at the bottom of each page." The dining room fell silent. Everyone was watching me. The realtor looked expectant. The transition specialist looked sympathetic. Mrs. Alvarez looked deeply uncomfortable. They were waiting for the old man to capitulate, to sign away his independence, his finances, and his home to keep the peace at a dinner party. I looked at the stack of papers. Then I looked at Brianna. "Are we reading rules tonight, Brianna?" I asked quietly. She blinked, momentarily thrown off by my calm demeanor. "It's not about rules, Edward. It's about—" "Good," I interrupted, my voice suddenly cutting through the room with the sharp, authoritative crack of a gavel. "Because I brought mine." I reached under the table and pulled out the heavy blue trust folder, dropping it onto the oak table with a loud, definitive thud. Right on cue, the front doorbell rang. Mrs. Alvarez, who was sitting closest to the foyer, jumped slightly. "I'll get it," she murmured, hurrying out of the dining room. A moment later, 2 people walked into the room and took the 2 empty chairs at the far end of the table. Evelyn Price was wearing a tailored black suit, carrying a legal briefcase that looked like a weapon. Carl Benson followed closely behind her, clutching a stack of notarized documents with the grim expression of an executioner. Brianna frowned, looking from me to the strangers. "Edward, who are these people? This is a private family dinner." Evelyn didn't introduce herself to Brianna. She didn't even look at her. She unlatched her briefcase and pulled out a small, portable digital projector, which she swiftly connected to her tablet. Within seconds, a bright image was projected onto the blank dining room wall behind Brianna. It was the photograph I had taken on Sunday morning, a massive, high-definition image of the laminated sheet. *House rules for Edward. The gasps around the table were immediate. Mrs. Alvarez covered her mouth. The realtor suddenly looked very pale. "What is this?" Brianna demanded, her face flushing a deep, angry red. "Edward, turn that off. This is inappropriate." "No, Brianna," Evelyn said, her voice freezing the air in the room. "What is inappropriate is attempting to coerce the legal owner of a property into a fraudulent transfer of equity by establishing a hostile living environment." Evelyn stood up. "My name is Evelyn Price. I am the senior property and estate attorney for Mr. Edward Whitaker. The gentleman next to me is Carl Benson, the trust management officer for the Miriam Whitaker Family Trust." The word trust hit Brianna like a physical blow. She looked at Michael, panic flashing in her eyes. "What trust? What is she talking about?" Michael shook his head rapidly. "I don't know. I swear, Brianna, I didn't know." "Allow me to clarify the ownership structure of this property for the guests in attendance," Carl Benson said, standing up and adjusting his glasses. "This house does not belong to Edward individually. It is the sole registered asset of the Miriam Whitaker Family Trust. Edward is the sole custodian and primary beneficiary with a guaranteed lifetime right of occupancy." Carl turned a cold, deadpan stare toward Brianna and her mother. Michael and Brianna Whitaker Carl continued, are currently residing on this property under a temporary family occupancy agreement that expired 12 months ago. They have no equity in the home, they have no managerial authority, legally speaking. They are holdover guests. Brianna Grip, do this, she shouted. We are family. We have rights. We were just trying to manage him for his own good. Evelyn laughed. It was a terrifying, humorless sound. Manage him? Evelyn asked, gesturing to the projection on the wall. Let's look at how you manage him. Mrs. Whitaker, let's look at your rules. Evelyn walked around the table, pointing a laser pen at the projected image. Rule number 5. All mail addressed to Edward must be placed in the basket by the front door for review. Evelyn looked at the transition specialist. Did you know she was intercepting federal mail to hide bank statements from the homeowner? That is a federal offense. The transition specialist immediately began packing her briefcase. I wasn't aware of the situation here, she stammered. Whispering Pines cannot be involved in contested elder care cases. Evelyn turned to the transition specialist. If your facility received any intake form claiming Mr. Whitaker was cognitively impaired, preserve it. If Mrs. Whitaker submitted that claim, it is now evidence. Evelyn moved the laser pointer down the list. Rule number 8. Edward may not use the garage workshop without supervision. Evelyn looked at the realtor. Did you know she locked the legal owner out of his own property so she could solicit unauthorized remodeling bids to secure a fraudulent home equity line? The realtor stood up so fast his chair almost tipped over. I'm leaving, he said, backing away from the table. I was told this was a standard estate transition. Do not call my office again. Brianna was hyperventilating now. You're twisting this, she screamed. We were trying to help him. He needs supervision. No, I said, finally speaking up. The room instantly went dead silent. You were trying to reduce me. I stood up from my chair and looked directly at Linda. Brianna's mother, who was sitting frozen with her glass of wine halfway to her mouth. An old man rattling around in a big house might be selfish, Linda, I said, my voice echoing off the dining room walls. But at least it's my house. I turned my gaze back to Brianna. You came into the home my wife built, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You took down her curtains. You hid her china. You locked me out of the garage where we spent our evenings, and then you had the absolute audacity to laminate a piece of paper telling me I wasn't allowed to speak her name at the dinner table. Michael finally broke. The sheer, overwhelming weight of the public humiliation shattered his cowardice. Brianna, stop! Michael yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. Just stop. Can't you see what you've done? We're going to lose everything. Brianna whirled on him, her mask of elegant control completely destroyed, revealing the ugly, ravenous greed underneath. Do you want to live in an apartment again? Brianna shrieked at her husband, not caring who heard her. Do you want to go back to being a failure? Because that is what happens if your father keeps playing king. He's an old man. He doesn't need this house. We do. Miriam is gone. This house should belong to people who can still use it. The silence that followed her outburst was absolute. The transition specialist and the realtor had frozen in the doorway. Mrs. Alvarez stared at Brianna with undisguised horror. Thank you, I said quietly into the silence. That was the first honest rule you have spoken. I looked at Evelyn and nodded. Evelyn picked up a thick stack of papers and dropped them directly on top of Brianna's fraudulent management authorizations. This is an immediate revocation of your temporary occupancy license, Evelyn announced, her voice ringing with legal finality. You have fundamentally violated the terms of your stay by attempting to assert unauthorized control over the property. But Evelyn wasn't finished. She turned to Michael. Furthermore, Evelyn continued, because you actively participated in a scheme to force the primary beneficiary out of the home for financial gain. You have triggered Clause 4C of the Miriam Whitaker Family Trust, the anti-coercion provision. Michael went perfectly still. What does that mean? He whispered. Carl Benson answered him. It means, Carl said coldly, that you are hereby permanently disinherited from the estate. You will receive no equity from this house, no payout from the life insurance, and no share of the investment portfolios. Your mother wrote that clause specifically to protect your father from exactly what you tried to do tonight. Generosity gave you rooms, Carl added, staring down at Brianna. It did not give you authority. Brianna looked around the room, her chest heaving. Her mother, Linda, wouldn't look at her. The professionals had fled. The neighbors were horrified. Her grand stage for a hostile takeover had become the site of her absolute ruin. You can't do this, Brianna whispered, tears of rage spilling down her face. You can't just throw family out on the street. I looked at the woman who had tried to steal my life. I looked at the son who had let her try. You gave me house rules in my own home, Brianna, I said, my voice steady, unyielding, and totally devoid of mercy. So here are the real ones. I leaned forward, planting my hands on the oak table. You will not touch my mail. You will not touch my deed. And after tonight, you will not sleep under Miriam's roof. You have exactly 2 hours to pack what fits in your car. The locks are being changed at midnight. Brianna had written 14 rules for me. The trust only needed one for her: leave. The packing process was a chaotic, humiliating scramble. Evelyn Price did not leave the dining room. She sat at the head of the table, sipping a glass of water, watching the clock with the cold precision of a predator, waiting for the exact moment to strike. Carl Benson stood by the front door, ensuring that Brianna and Michael only removed their personal belongings and not a single piece of property that belonged to the house. By 11:45, the front lawn was littered with hastily packed garbage bags and a few expensive leather suitcases. Brianna was crying, not out of remorse, but out of pure, unadulterated frustration. Her grand plan to secure a multi-million-dollar property and ship her father-in-law off to a nursing home had collapsed in the span of 30 minutes. Worse still, her mother, Linda, who had enthusiastically supported the idea of pushing me out, had quickly realized the legal danger and abruptly announced that she didn't have room for Brianna and Michael to stay at her house for more than a few days. At exactly midnight, a heavy white van pulled into the driveway. The locksmith had arrived. I stood on the front porch, the cold night air biting at my cheeks, and watched as Michael loaded the last garbage bag into the trunk of his car. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't try to argue with Carl Benson. He just looked completely defeated. A man who had gambled his entire future on his wife's ruthless ambition and lost everything. When their taillights finally disappeared down the street, I turned around and walked back into my home. The house was completely silent. It was a good silence. The kind of silence that settles into the foundation when a heavy, unnatural pressure is finally lifted. The very next morning, the reclamation of my home began. Mrs. Alvarez, who had witnessed the spectacular implosion of Brianna's takeover the night before, came over bright and early with a tray of warm cinnamon rolls. She didn't ask questions about the trust or the legal drama. She simply rolled up her sleeves and asked, "Where do you want to start, Edward?" We started in the dining room. We brought Miriam's heavy velvet curtains down from the attic and hung them back up, instantly restoring the warm, elegant shadow that Brianna had tried to erase. We carried the boxes of Miriam's antique china up from the damp basement and carefully placed every single plate back into the oak display cabinet. By noon, I walked out to the backyard with a pair of heavy bolt cutters. I stood in front of the garage workshop, gripping the handles of the cutters, and clamped them down over the hasp of the industrial padlock Brianna had installed. With a sharp, satisfying snap, the hardened steel broke. I pulled the lock off, opened the heavy wooden doors, and breathed in the familiar, comforting scent of sawdust, motor oil, and Miriam's old sewing machine. The sanctuary was mine again. I went downstairs next. Brianna had avoided Miriam's sewing room because it was too old-fashioned to impress her friends. But neglect is also a kind of erasure. Dust had gathered on the old Singer machine. A half-finished quilt still sat folded in the wicker basket where Miriam had left it. I opened the window, let the stale air out, and placed her silver thimble back on the table. For the first time in months, the room did not feel like storage. It felt like a room waiting patiently for someone to remember it. Over the next few days, Evelyn Price finalized the legal fortifications. By Monday morning, Evelyn had sent formal preservation letters to Whispering Pines, the realtor and the catering company. Every email Brianna had sent describing my decline was now frozen as potential evidence in an elder coercion complaint. Because the mail rule provided hard evidence, Evelyn also issued a formal warning letter to Brianna, stating that any further contact with my property or correspondence would result in a police report. Furthermore, I contacted my credit card company and formally disputed the catering charges for the dinner as unauthorized. The woman who had tried to make me look unstable had accidentally built a file on herself. She didn't just lose the house, she was now facing potential legal ruin. We restructured the trust, adding even stricter clauses regarding Michael's potential inheritance. He would have to prove a prolonged period of independent stability and genuine remorse before he could even be considered for reinstatement as a secondary beneficiary. A week later, I was sitting at the kitchen island, drinking my morning coffee, when I heard a hesitant knock at the front door. I walked through the foyer and opened the heavy wooden door. Michael stood on the porch. He looked exhausted. He was wearing a wrinkled shirt, and the dark circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't slept properly since the night he was evicted. "Dad," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Can I come in?" I looked at him for a long moment. Then I opened the door a little wider. "You can stand in the hallway, Michael." He stepped inside, looking nervously around the foyer, as if he expected Evelyn Price to step out of the shadows with another stack of legal documents. I needed to see you," Michael said, staring at the floor. "Brianna and I are staying in a cheap motel by the interstate. Her parents kicked us out on Tuesday. I'm trying to find a job, any job, just to pay for an apartment." I didn't say anything. I waited for him to get to the point. "Dad, I am so sorry," Michael blurted out, tears suddenly welling up in his eyes. I should have stopped her. I knew what she was doing was wrong. I knew that list of rules was insulting. I should have stepped in and stopped her from doing it. I felt that familiar, heavy ache in my chest, the instinct of a father wanting to comfort a hurting child. But Miriam's voice echoed in my mind. "He will always seek the path of least resistance." "No, Michael," I said, my voice quiet but incredibly firm. He looked up at me, confused. "You shouldn't have stopped her," I told him, looking directly into his eyes. "You should have stopped yourself from hiding behind her." Michael blinked, the truth of the statement hitting him harder than any legal document ever could. "You didn't just fail to stop Brianna," I explained. "You actively participated in her delusion. You sent text messages agreeing to force me into a facility. You sat at my dining room table and let your mother-in-law call me selfish for living in the house I built. You didn't want to stop Brianna, Michael. You just wanted her to succeed quietly so you wouldn't have to feel guilty about it." I was just scared, Dad," he whispered. "I didn't want to go back to being broke. And you were willing to sacrifice my freedom and your mother's memory to avoid it," I replied. "I love you, Michael. I always will. But forgiveness is a process, not a switch you can flip because you're uncomfortable in a motel. You have a lot of work to do before you can sit at my kitchen table again." I opened the front door, signaling that the conversation was over. Michael nodded slowly, wiping his eyes. He stepped back out onto the porch. "I'll do the work, Dad," he said softly. "I promise. If you want to prove remorse, Michael, stop apologizing to me and start correcting the lies you allowed her to tell," I said. "Then start by paying back the catering charge your wife put on my card. Start by writing to Mrs. Alvarez and telling her I am not declining. Start by finding a room you can afford without using my house as collateral. We'll see, I replied, and gently closed the door. 3 days later, Mrs. Alvarez showed me the handwritten letter Michael had delivered to every neighbor Brianna had spoken to. He had actually started doing the work. I walked back into the kitchen, the morning sunlight streaming through the windows, illuminating the oak cabinets Miriam had painted by hand. I walked over to the refrigerator. The large, laminated sheet of * house rules for Edward was still taped to the stainless steel door. I had left it there all week as a reminder of how quickly a sanctuary can be stolen if you don't defend it. I reached up and pulled the tape free. I didn't throw it in the trash. I walked into my bedroom, opened the heavy oak nightstand, and slid the laminated sheet into the blue trust folder, placing it right next to Miriam's letter. It belonged there. It was part of the house's history now, a permanent record of a battle fought and won. Then, I walked back into the kitchen with a small, simple piece of unlaminated white paper. I took a magnet and placed the new paper in the exact center of the refrigerator door. It didn't have 14 dictates. It didn't outline restrictions or threaten transitions. It simply stated the foundation of the home. The real rules. 1. This is Edward's home. 2. Respect is not optional. 3. Gratitude is not ownership. 4. No one moves the memory of Miriam without asking. 5. Anyone who makes the owner feel like a guest leaves first. I stepped back, looking at the small paper. It felt right. It felt clean. Brianna thought rules were written by the loudest person in the kitchen. She thought laminating disrespect made it official, and that speaking with authority made her the owner. Miriam knew better. Real rules are not written on a refrigerator by a desperate guest. Real rules are written in deeds, in trust papers, and in the quiet promises people keep long after the house goes silent. If you were Edward, would you have given Michael and Brianna another chance because they were family? Or did the moment she put house rules for Edward on his own refrigerator prove they had already forgotten whose home it was? Let me know in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for more stories.